Um, Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to be here with you. We're going to get started with this weather webinar, weather update. We've been looking forward to this for a while, as it's our last one before the PRF deadline, and so we've been looking forward to this and getting some more info as we get ready to lock in some coverage for PRF. And so we know we've been looking forward to it. A lot of our customers have, and so we're excited to be here. But yeah, with that, we just want to give a reminder that deadline is December 1st, and so that last week of November is going to be Thanksgiving, so it's going to be busy. So if you haven't yet signed up and got your stuff locked in yet, then you want to contact your agent and get that wrapped up so that we can get that coverage in for next year. But with that, we'll just hand over the time to Brian, and we're grateful to have him here, and we're excited to see what he has for us.
All right. Well, fantastic. I am going to go ahead and share my screen here and we will get started. All right. So again, I know it's obviously an important time of year and we've got a lot of stuff to go over through this evening, but I think a lot of the stuff's going to be very targeted as I always try to make it be that way, especially as we head toward the end of this year and move into 2025. But I always like to take a look back and see what has been causing problems or what has been helping us out over the past few months or so. And our short-term composite drought indicator clearly shows that, not just in the south and western part of the country, but also up across the middle part of the United States, northern plains, folks in eastern Wyoming, the western Nebraska, Dakotas, struggling a little bit, eastern Montana, and also parts of southwest Montana, which fully haven't recovered from last year's snow drought. So while there are some areas that are in good shape, there are some areas that are still suffering mightily. And I think going forward, with the way the weather pattern's set up, there will be some areas that continue to see drought materialize, maintain itself, and also grow. This is a 30-day precipitation anomaly. So this is what has happened the past 30 days or so. And obviously, most of California has been dry. Southern Nevada, southwest Utah, we have had some moisture through central and eastern portions of Utah. But really, the big bullseyes of moisture, at least over the past month or so, have taken place up across parts of the Pacific Northwest, Colorado, northeast Arizona, and eastward across New Mexico, Kansas, and Oklahoma. So certainly a haves and have-nots type of thing, but that's really how we roll. You know that in the western half of the United States. The forecast over the next couple of weeks, when we look at precipitation anomalies, does show some moisture coming in Northern California, extreme Northern California. The Pacific Northwest is still in there. Eastern Montana, I think, is going to get on the act a little bit. But the real flavor of this forecast is that the far southern part of California, southern Nevada, southern Utah, and western Colorado, Arizona, probably going to get shut out a little bit as far as this pattern is concerned, because what's happening, these storms are coming in from the west and they're hitting the Pacific coast, and then they kind of skip over the Intermountain West and then materialize a little bit farther to the east. So that's kind of how we're going to roll over the next couple of weeks. And from a temperature standpoint, this is really over the next 7 days, really from the 15th through the 22nd. There's going to be plenty of cool air across the western United States because we have some storms coming in. So these are the forecast temperature anomalies from the 15th through the 22nd. It takes into account nighttime lows and daytime highs. You average that out, and wherever you're seeing blue and green, that's where temperatures are going to be cooler than average over the next 7 to 8 days. Beyond that trend, from 22nd through Black Friday, as we head into the back part of the month, a lot of that cool air, kind of relaxes a little bit, at least that cool air signal. And we kind of come back to some areas that are cooler, some other areas that are warmer, but no gigantic cold signal across the western half of the country. I think the cool air, in many cases, isn't coming from Canada during the next week. It's just simply being attributed to the storminess coming in off the Pacific that's cooling things down. And Lord knows that after the past couple of months or so, we could use some cooler than average temperatures across the western US because a lot of us have been dealing with some warmth. I was kind of on the fence of whether or not I wanted to show this graphic to you or not, but this is the European models forecast through the end of this year. So it takes us right through December 29th, basically. And you're looking at this forecast precipitation anomalies. So the trend here, you see, if you look out into California, the northwest part of the state, there are some areas that are doing okay, but largely the spine of the Sierras ends up below average. Southern Nevada, southern Utah, southern California, Arizona, western New Mexico, western Colorado also is being forecast to end up below average in terms of precipitation. So I don't like to take this model to the bank all the time, but it kind of has a similar flavor to what the forecast looks like going forward, where these storms are largely missing out in producing moisture across the Southwest and especially the Four Corners area. And the better moisture ends up farther north, northwest, and then east out into the midsection of the country. Temperature wise, it has that cold pocket of air across the western, really third of the country. And again, I think it owes to the pattern that we're going to be seeing where the storms come in. So there's relatively cooler air, but a lot of the better moisture gets shoved in those other directions, like I had mentioned. Again, I don't like to hang my hat on this type of a model for a forecast, but I wanted to show it to you because it's kind of a similar trend to what we've been seeing, at least lately, and we might actually finish this year with somewhat of a similar trend. So we're going to keep that in mind. Let's move beyond that and let's look at the sea surface temperature anomalies and what's going on with La Nina right now. For those of you that may not know, La Nina is just simply cooler than average water out there in the equatorial Pacific, the area that I have ovaled right there where you're seeing the blue. That's where we're seeing cooler than average sea surface temperatures right now. Not excessively cool. And we're kind of entering that window of opportunity that if this La Nina wants to make a move towards something stronger, it's going to have to do that because it has not done that. And in my gut says it's not going to do that right now. In fact, if we look at it in terms of a graph, if you will, that oval shaped area out there in terms of temperatures above or below average, really, we've been below average for a while, but we really haven't made a move below negative 0.5 until early September. So for the past 2 months, we've basically been below negative 0.5 in that region, which technically meets La Nina criteria. But look at what it's done here recently. We're kind of bouncing right back up to almost neutral conditions. The way I see it now. Now, I think that there are some things happening in the Pacific that will allow this La Nina to possibly intensify a little bit from where it is. But in terms of seeing a moderate or a strong event right now, I just don't see that happening at all. I think weak La Nina conditions at best are going to be what we're going to see through the winter. And that's with the ocean. We also like the atmosphere to respond to that cool water out there, and it simply hasn't been doing so. So, this graph right now shows you anything that's above that blue dashed line is La Nina territory. Anything below the red dashed line is El Nino territory. And I have the red oval over here showing you that the past really several months since spring, the pressure patterns in the atmosphere have been basically in neutral. It has not been favoring La Nina. It has not been favoring El Nino. And the pressure patterns in the atmosphere also have to respond for that La Nina effect to be something significant. So it's not just having the cooler than average water out there. The atmosphere has to respond. And right now, we are firmly in neutral territory right now. And that kind of owes to what I've said that this La Nina looks to be a weak event at best. And our computer model information, for the most part, is showing the same thing. So the December forecast here, all those models on the left side, and you know from what I've had in recent webinars that two of my favorite ones are the BOM, the Bureau of Meteorology out of Australia, and the ECMWF out of Europe. And those two models, okay, are taking us at max to negative 0.4. All right. NOAA's model brings us way over here to about a negative 1.3. And NOAA's model, which is our own government model here in the United States, has been consistently over forecasting and been too aggressive with this La Nina. And I don't see any reason to suggest to me why that's going to change because the majority of the other models through December have us really at weak La Nina territory at best. If we go to January, you can see some of those models make a move toward better La Nina territory, but really weak at best. NOAA's model, again, is about status quo there. But if you look at the mean that's on the bottom, that gray bar barely makes it to a negative zero point 0.8, which is the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia's threshold to meet La Nina. It doesn't meet their threshold. It will technically meet our threshold here in the United States, but not the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia. And if we push it toward February, you see the models then back off on the intensity by quite a bit. In fact, the BOM up there at the very top has us in neutral territory. And by March, the BOM actually pushes us toward positive territory out there. Not El Nino status, but it's moving that direction. And that's something that I think is probably going to continue because if you look at April's forecast, it pushes it even further. Again, I still think for the most part in April, we're looking at neutral conditions. Neither El Nino or La Nina out there. But it shows you that the modeling trend is going from weak La Nina to neutral, and possibly some of them, at least the BOM and the Meteo out of France, pushing us toward El Nino. I don't want to go there just yet, but it is definitely something that I'm watching closely to see if we're going to pivot out of a weak La Nina event and go toward an El Nino sometime this spring. We'll worry more about that later. In the meantime, what I've done here is I've listed all the years up there at the top of the page where we have had just weak La Nina conditions. Okay. And this is the precipitation anomalies that have been averaged out through all of those years from November through March. And what that does is it gives us some dry signals in there from Southern California, Southern Nevada, far Southwest Utah. I think most of Southern Utah would probably be included in there too. Southern Arizona, Texas, parts of Kansas. And then we have a pretty stout dry signal across the far Southeast and the Mid Atlantic. Parts of the Pacific Northwest up there in Northwest and West Washington also shows that. But the wetter signals are Northern California, Western Oregon, parts of Eastern Oregon, and right up there across the Northern Rockies. Most of Idaho kind of gets lumped into there as well as Western Montana. So that's when you average out all those years. All right. If we look in history to say the past handful of La Nina events that are close to this event, you get this graph right here. 2024's trend is right there in the dark gray, and it's on the weaker side of all these other years that I have displayed right there, but it's at least in the ballpark of 96, 99, 08, 11, and 22. All right. And when you take those years and average them out, just like I did on the previous map, you get a map that looks like this. And some of the same dry locations are still dry. Southern California, Southern Nevada, most of Arizona, most of New Mexico, most of Texas, but the real stout dry signal when you take the really weak flavor of La Nina, it really lights itself up across the Gulf Coast region, the Southeast, and on up into the Mid-Atlantic. Wetter than average, again, sets up shop across most of the West and the Northwest part of the country. And what this graphic tells me is that the more active weather favors northern areas, and a lot of the southern tier of the country, really the southern third for the most part of the United States, gets left on the drier side of the coin. So again, because this is a weak signal, what this means is that there is going to be more variability in the pattern. All right. And I get questions all the time about from folks in California about the atmospheric rivers and how many we could see and is this going to be active or whatever. This could very well be one of those years where we stack a wet month with a dry month, and then a wet month and a dry month, or we get a big burst of atmospheric moisture coming into California and it's real wet, and then we shut it down for 6 weeks. The variability within the pattern overall, I think, is going to be much more prevalent than on other years when we would have been really locked into a La Nina or locked into an El Nino. Those two things with a stronger signal produce weather regimes that keep the wet wet and the dry dry. And I don't see a real strong signal locking us into that, at least at the present time. Okay. So if you're wondering what a La Nina weather pattern looks like, this is essentially it. And I want to draw your attention out there on the far left where it says blocking high pressure. That blocking high pressure, it's really critical how close to the United States and North America that sets up. If it's farther west, that allows storms to come down the Pacific coast and end up then and give the Western United States better chances to be wet. If that high locks itself closer, then everything gets pushed off farther to the east and gets dumped into the Pacific Northwest, the Northern Plains, and eventually the Midwest. And we have a drier flavor that exists really across the southern tier of the United States. So this is one of those forecasts where this is not something I share with folks and then I let it be for 4 or 5 months and say, oh, well, let's look at it again. I am looking at this stuff every single day because there are little tells, if you will, as to how this pattern sets up and how we position ourselves going forward. And I know that for those of us that are looking at PRF, we don't have the ability to change those intervals. Okay, we have to lock those intervals in best we can with the evidence that we have before us, and that's what I'm trying to do the best I can to kind of show you some of that evidence that I'm looking at, so we can do that over the for the 2025. So I've shown you what's going on right now. I've shown you history. So let's look at some computer models going forward. And this is the Euro seasonal model forecast for November. And it's been doing a really good job because the real wet conditions that you see right there that it was forecasting have materialized. And there's going to be another couple of storms move into the midsection of the country that's going to keep the remainder of November fairly soggy. That being said, the West and the Southwest have been getting shut out. California's had problems. Western Arizona, Southern Nevada, Southwest Utah, those areas have been having some problems. And I don't see that really changing a great deal as we finish November. What about December? December still has a very similar dry signal going on further across the West and the Southwest. You're wetter midsection of the country, and you're wetter in the Pacific Northwest and parts of Idaho and Western Montana. If we go to January, that dry signal gets tamped southward a little bit. Still, California may struggle, southern Nevada, southern Utah, extending out into the plains, but certainly it has a La Nina like flavor, keeping the wetter and more active part of the storm track farther north, at least from the Pacific Northwest into the upper portion of the Midwest. February's forecast, same type of deal. The wetter areas to the north and northwest stay that way. The farther west and southwest you go, you struggle a little bit. The same thing could be said across the southeastern United States with a pretty stout dry signal there too through February. For March, drier, still southern half of California, southern Nevada, southern Utah, out across Colorado and points southward. Wetter, certainly more active the farther north you go. If we go to April, this is the thing that kind of troubles me a little bit because any type of La Nina signal is likely gone by probably March at the latest, really, as I showed you. And in April, if we start to warm those temperatures up there out there in the ocean, we could produce another signal that could lead itself to maybe some potential dryness that exists across the four corner states, not just for April here, okay, but also for May. And that dry signal expands northward up into Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. So this is something that I'm worried about that we could have drier than average conditions for this winter. And then for the spring, we struggle a little bit right there. Historically speaking, I love it when we are not locked into El Nino or La Nina as we head into the spring because it allows the normal seasonal change to take place. But I will caution you, even though La Nina is going to be gone by this time, the overall state of the Pacific, the background state of the Pacific, the PDO that you always hear me talk about, is still going to be cold or negative. And that continues to help aid a drier weather pattern across the West and the Southwest. So I'm not fully confident that this is going to happen. I'm just saying historically and the way the ocean is stacked, it's something that I'm concerned about. And I think it's something that anybody that's signing up intervals, you might have to massage those percentages through those intervals, especially if you need that moisture in the spring and you don't get it. Those are some intervals that you might look to target, even if it's just weak coverage. At least you're a little bit more balanced instead of loading things up into just a couple of intervals. So that's the Euro seasonal model. The NMME model, you're going to see some similar things here as well. This is its forecast for December. Wherever you're seeing the brown, that's where it's drier than average or being forecast to. All right. January, you see it's got a drier flavor across most of California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. The only real wetter bullseyes are across the northern Rockies, parts of the northern plains, and into the eastern Corn Belt, Ohio Valley. For February, there's your dry signal showing up there again. It does creep back up there into southern parts of Utah by February. And I'm not telling you to just take the specifics of this model or any model to the bank. I'm asking you to at least just recognize the trend that it's wetter north, drier south. And for March, you still have that kind of thing going on. But the core, at least by March, with this model, you see that the core of that dry signal kind of anchoring itself a little bit right there around the four corner states. And that kind of perpetuates itself into April too. Okay. So that's on board as well with what the Euro model was showing just a second ago. And by May, that dryness continues to expand northward, encompassing most of Utah by that time too. And that dry signal is pretty stout. And by June, it relaxes a little bit. And then by later June, obviously we would be pivoting toward looking to our south to see what kind of monsoon is going to set up. And I'll be honest with you, I don't have a real clear cut feel for what the monsoon is going to be setting up during the summer. I know the last time we moved from a La Nina episode to an El Nino was in the spring of 23. And I know during the summer of 23, the monsoon did underperform across the southwest part of the country. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but it's something that if you really need the moisture during that time, and I know it's the wetter time of year, it's something that you might have to at least look at covering with some of those percentages. But that takes us right now through June with this. Another model here, December, January, February. This is from the IRI. It still has the drier signal farther west and southwest, as well as across the southeast part of the country. If we look at Feb, March, April, you see that dry signal expanding northward, just like the other models were showing. All right. If we go to what the Climate Prediction Center says, this is for January, February, March. Obviously, the dry signal is in a very similar spot that I've been showing you with the models. Wetter the farther northwest you go, and obviously across the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. If we go March, April, May, the dry signal is expanding northward, encompassing, at least the southern 2/3 of Utah and all the four corners. May, June, July, it moves farther north, up across, and actually kind of anchors itself across the northern Rockies, but still includes areas farther south. I think I have one more in here too. July, August, September. Okay. Still forecasted farther north. But this model is also producing this dry signal because if we move to a weak El Nino from late spring through this summer, that signature dries out parts of the Pacific Northwest. It dries out the northern Rockies and northern plains. And I think that's what this is recognizing here, that the confidence is low, but the pivot potential is there. And it's something that I think we need to at least pay attention to through the middle part of 25. So with that in mind, I will entertain any questions that you guys have, or if we need to go back over something else.
Yeah, Brian, I was just going to ask when you mentioned that kind of setting up through the summer into those northern and Pacific Northwest, does that mean that there is some potential to have some relief from that dryness down in that southern third of the US that was so dry through the spring?
But that's also predicated on what happens with the monsoon. Okay. So if the monsoon even just underperforms, doesn't fail, but just underperforms, a lot of those areas farther south are already going to be behind the eight ball because they missed out on spring moisture. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
So, this year I've had a lot of folks approach me about, the balancing of these percentages as we move through intervals. And is this a year specifically to just, hey, I am rocking in there with two intervals and that's the way to go? I would caution against that because if you blow those two intervals or even just blow one of them, then you don't have anything later on to recoup that when you might need that moisture at a more critical time, during the monsoon if we underperform. So, far be it for me to set somebody's intervals for them, but I would be much more apt to spread out my risk a little bit more this year than maybe if we had a real strong La Nina and a real strong signal with that. Sure, that may be a better time to do that. But where the pattern variability is probably going to be quite a bit higher than other years when we had that strong signal, I think it's, spreading that coverage out is never a bad thing with a situation like that.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
In my humble opinion, mind you.
So if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat. We had a couple of questions that people wrote in earlier this week. One of them, Brian, I know you mentioned on one of those graphs earlier on that you had pulled some years that had a weak La Nina and kind of put them on that graph. And looking at some of those, are there any of those that you feel strongly about if someone wanted to use for an analog year? Are there any of those or groups of years, I guess, that could be looked at for that?
A particular year is going to be a problem
Okay.
this year. So when you lump all those in together, and I'm going to try to get back to let's go back here. We'll just bring those up. When you're trying to pinpoint a specific year, you also want to get those sea surface temperatures lined up with the atmosphere. And there is not one year that is looking better than another at this point. So I think what we have to do here is just simply recognize the signals that are going to be shown right here in these two maps. All of those years right there are reflective of what happened during weak La Ninas. And the areas of interest that I want to focus on here that are dry will show up in the next map that I'll show you too. It's the far southwest, south central plains, the southeast, and the mid Atlantic. Okay. If you look at what's happened with La Ninas of the past that are close to the strength, and again, I will show you right there in the middle of the graph. You see where that gray line is? It's on the weaker side of all of those events that I have listed here, okay, in terms of strength. But if you look at all those events rolled in together here, this is the map that you got from November through March. You still see those same dry spots, don't you? It's a little more magnified on this particular graphic than the other one. But also look at the wetness that comes into parts of the West right there from November to March. That to me indicates that pattern variability, the farther north you live, and this is especially true for northern Utah, the farther north you live, the more pattern variability you're going to get. That's what this map suggests to me. The farther south you live, your pattern variability goes down quite a bit because you've got a pretty good dry signal there from Southern California all the way through the southeast and the mid Atlantic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you. And I know you mentioned as a part of this too, with that high blocking pressure, kind of depends on where it sets up. Yeah, that graph there. Is that something that you have any indication of it being farther west or getting closer to the coast, or is it that's kind of hard to nail down?
It's pretty hard to nail down right now because we're still dealing with the seasonal change, and
Yeah.
and because in many cases you might say, well, that seasonal change has been delayed. It's been warm. We haven't had any type of cold air to speak of really come south with any type of staying power. And to be honest, I don't see any of that taking place at least for a little while yet. So until that gets settled and we get into winter, you know, would this be different if we had PRF sign up deadline on January 2nd instead of December 2nd? Would that be better? Well, sure, because it means we'd have another month to look at this. But the thing to know is that blocking high pressure out there is likely going to be weaker than if we had a stronger La Nina. And because it's weaker, that allows more pattern variability to come into play. So from my standpoint, the farther west and southwest you live, your dry signal is going to be stronger just simply because of that. Okay. The pattern variability will be greater the farther north you go. And that's shown up not only in those analog years that I showed, but also within the models. You saw the farther north you go, the wetter things were obviously prone to be.
Thank you. Yeah, okay. A question came in the chat. North central Kansas seems to be in a very equal chance pattern. Is early spring a good bet to be dry? Will PRF recommendations change from today's webinar?
Uh, well, will it change as we head into the middle part of the spring? I would say that it's going to be massaged, of course. I mean, as I said, this is not something you leave sit for 4 or 5 months and don't touch again. So, a couple of things that are going to be key with that. how much snow do we lay across the northern plains? All right. Because if we lay a bunch of snow in the northern plains, that will push the storm track farther south, inevitably. And you see historically, where does that storm track roll right through? North central Kansas. Okay. So the farther north you are of that storm track, the more comfortable I feel about it being wetter and colder than average. The farther south you are of that track, okay, the worse you are. But if we look at some of those analog years, all right, you could see all of those weak La Nina years, November to March, there was a dry signal right there in north central Kansas. The computer models also showed that dry signal in north central Kansas. If you compare them where we are with this particular graphic, you see it gets in northwestern parts of Kansas, but the farther east you go, things are better in terms of moisture. So is north central Kansas on the border between active weather to the northeast and drier weather to the southwest? Probably, yeah. So I think at minimum, you at least have to guard that March April interval with some coverage, okay? Because the models were also showing it to be a little bit dry during that time. So if you're simply just, like all of us are, we're using the evidence that we have with us right now to make plans for those intervals. That's the best information you have to go with. I think you at least have to guard against it there.
Thank you. We had a question. This was from earlier in the week. They said, I'd like to see probabilities of outcomes, not just likely, most likely, but an actual 70% or something like that. And so I guess that would maybe be probability of the weakening La Nina or the neutral pattern. I guess that maybe is what that question is asking. Is there
Are we talking about the probabilities for La Nina or probabilities of precipitation? I guess I'm not sure
said
what.
probabilities of outcomes? And so I guess we could go with, yeah, an outcome of a La Nina or a neutral pattern coming before spring. I
I
guess,
think we'll
yeah,
be in
whatever.
neutral. I think we will be in neutral. I really don't even need to do probabilities. I think because of this event being weak at best right now, when it is supposed to be strengthening into what it's going to be, um, I'm pretty confident that La Nina is done probably by March. And I think that's probably at the latest, to be honest. And if you want percentages here, the NMME's got them. I mean, those are, if you look just simply at, say, January here, where you're seeing those lighter shades of brown, there's a 40 to 50% chance that you're looking at drier than average conditions right there. Okay.
Yeah.
And again, I always hesitate to use percentages because to me, it's either drier than average or it's not. Okay, it's not like, so when you look at the odds of that, you could even look at the and I'll go forward here to the Climate Prediction Center too, if you want to use that. Going, I mean, this particular one in general, December, January, February, you see over here probabilities of percentages. You see where those stout dry percentages are located, and that's where they're forecast to be located Feb, March, and April too. Okay. So if you want percentages, there's some there. Um, and then over here, these are just simple anomalies. So again, it's the same thing. Whether you're looking at anomalies or you're looking at percentages, where that dry signal is stoutest, that's where your higher chances of dry weather are likely going to be. Okay.
Good deal. Yeah, no, I think that,
Maybe I'm missing the question entirely there, but
no, I feel like that hopefully answered that question for
yeah.
that person. Um, there's no more questions in the chat. If you have any questions, please put them in now. Once again, reminder that December 1st is the deadline, and so make sure to get that signed up and get in contact with your agent so we can get that lined up for next year. But if we don't have any questions, then thank you, Brian. We appreciate your time and this information. This has been great, and I think this will be super helpful for people as we line things up for next year. So once again, thank you, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Great. Thanks, McKay.
Yep.